my grandpa lived in Blekinge, Sweden, and way back in the 1800s, 4 boys and 1 girl, a sister, all came to Rockford, Illinois. But 2 of the boys and the sister stayed in Kirkland, Illinois. And then David and Alfred came to Rockford. And then, of course, Ellen came from Sweden. And I don't know too much about her background, but she came from Sweden, and then they met and they got married. So it's Ellen Carlson and David Carlson. And then David, he had to get a job, and there was a fella doing sidewalks and doing a little roofing and concrete and cellars. And he worked for him for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years. And then as this man got older, then David said, well, I would like to take over so he bought the company. But then he named it David Carlson Roofing Company, 1888. Yeah. And then he ran the company for quite a few years, and then the family grew. My dad was the oldest. Then there was Edith and Ruth and Einar and Martin Carlson. Well, Martin passed away when he was about 15 years of age, and Einar was about 4 years younger than my dad. And my dad got a job at the railroad, and he was working as a clerk at the railroad. And then his father had an operation, and my dad said, well, it didn't turn out good, and he passed away by about 58. And then it was up to my dad to sell the roofing company, David Carlson Roofing Company. And the offers were, back in those days, very low. So it made my dad angry. He said, I'll take over the company. And then he asked Uncle Alfred, who had been working in construction. He said, Uncle Alfred, will you run the crews, and I'll do the management. And so my dad owned the business, and the David Carlson Roofing Company. And then Einar was growing up, and he went to college. And Einar finally graduated, and he went into the service for a year or 2. And then my dad said to his brother, he said, I'll give you half of the business. So there was Einar Carlson and my dad. And they ran the business many, many years. And it was a good, solid business. We had a shingle that was called a cyclone shingle. And it was very popular in Rockford for re-roofing houses and that. And one story I remember, there was a company in Chicago that they did business with. And then we had this bad tornado, and many roofs were damaged and that. And my dad called this man in Chicago, and he said, oh, we're going to need a lot of shingles. And I remember a Ruberoid company, and the man said, Carlson, don't worry, we'll send carloads of shingles, and you don't have to pay for them until the work is all done. Oh. I mean, that was the way business was done years ago. And of course, they put on these cyclone shingles all over Rockford. But then getting down to Dave. Dave was 6 years older than I was. And then I had another sister 4 years older, and then I had a younger sister 4 years younger. But then the war came, World War II, and Carlson Roofing had contracts to do with 3 or 4 Army depots. And one of them was way south in Illinois, down by Peoria. And Dave got an exemption to stay home because my dad was getting older and Einar was older. So Dave stayed home. But then in 1942, I got a notice. I had graduated from high school, but I got a notice that I was going to be drafted. So, but here's where a father pays off. I was told to go to Chicago and to the draft office, and my dad investigated the Marines and the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. He found that there was one organization called the Seabees, which was part of the Navy, and they did construction, airports, but they also had builders. And my dad told me, he says, Ed, he said, maybe you should, if you can, get into the Seabees because you'll be learning about carpentry and maybe some roofing, which will help you when you get out. When I think about it, these fathers can really help their kids. Yes. And that's what I did. I went into Chicago and I said, CB, oh, sure. So in 1943, March, I joined the Seabees and was sent way over to the East Coast, Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, and did my training. And then for 2 or 3 months, then we went up to New Hampshire, I think it was, or Connecticut, and for a few months, and then a long train ride all the way across to California, to Camp Parks, there for a couple of months, and then to Port Hueneme. This is still 1943. And then we got on LSTs, a flat-bottom boat, and we went to Honolulu. And when we got to Honolulu, we had some projects and jobs to do. And but there's 850 men in a CB battalion, and most of the men there was probably probably 100 young fellows my age, 19, 20, but then most of them were construction people, maybe foremen or contractors or
Sure.
And so they were so kind to us young fellows, teaching us how to do this and teaching us how to do that. But we were on Honolulu only for a couple of months, so then they said, well, get on board some more LSTs. And this was in November of 1943. And then they told us when we were out in the ocean, they said, you're going to go to the Gilbert Islands. There's going to be a big invasion on Tarawa. And the Marines are going to attack the island. There's 5,000 Japanese on this island. And the island was very small, but the Japanese had built large concrete bunkers. And then they had wrapped the concrete with coconut log trees. So they were just about 2 or 3 stories high in a big, deep basement. There were several of them. And the Marines knew that they were in for some trouble. And they thought of whether they could take it in one day, you know. They had airplanes, they had aircraft carriers there, and they were bombing the bunkers, but they didn't, the bombs just bounced off. Anyways, the Marines had to get into their boats, and they went, but when they were about 300 feet from the island, the sea was down and the boats couldn't go any further. So they had to get out of the boats, hold their guns ahead, and walk. And so many of them were killed at that time. And where they thought that it was going to be a one-day battle, it ended up being a 3-day battle. And then the Marines went around the island and landed on the other side. But it was we just stayed in our ship because they didn't want us to go ashore, because we had carbines and that. But finally they let us go ashore. And I remember the first night on the island, we told to dig a deep foxhole. And I remember I was scared to death because they thought that there might be a counterattack.
Right.
Some of the Japanese. And we prayed and prayed, and I really thank God at that time that I knew some prayers.
Yes.
And we got through that night. And the next day we were able to get up. And then they told us that after the battle was over, and many of the Japanese killed themselves. 5,000 Japanese died, and over 1,000 Marines died. Then it was left up to our battalion to bury everybody. So we spent days and weeks taking the bodies and burying them, you know. But that was a great experience for me. And then on the island, then they asked, I joined with a carpenter group, and so I was sent to another island to build some tanks for for gasoline and oil, and we built those tanks. And we worked hard in that. But then on the island, all of a sudden I had a terrible pain. And they said, well, there's a little clinic. We have a little tent down there, a little clinic. We'll go down there and see what's wrong with you. And I went down there, and the doctor said, well, lay down and try to lift your legs. And I couldn't. He says, appendicitis. And he said, oh, it doesn't look good, he said. But luckily, there was a New York physician who had joined the Navy, and he happened to be on Tarawa, and happened to be in our little clinic. And he said, well, I'm going to operate. And by golly, he operated, and then I had morphine for 2 or 3 days, and everything turned out good. And I survived that. So that was a great experience for me.